the largest, maybe 10, 15 years from now. And then the U.S. will stay as a very strong pull, and then Europe will be the third. And then there will be a lot of smaller pulls, Russia, India, and depending on that, like maybe some in Africa and the Middle East and so on. So the multipolar world just means that the power is going to be diffused. So there's not going to be one, the hegemon, one person dictating. And there are going to be a lot of choices, So there will be like more choices for social media, more choices for mainstream media, more political philosophies, more technologies, right? Like, at some point the Huawei sanctions are going to go away. It cannot last forever. So then there will be like, people in the U.S. will be able to buy Huawei smartphones, Xiaomi cars, so it's going to be like more choices, more freedom. It'll be basically, the democratization of all things, like finance, economy, philosophy, military, technology, media, and so on.
Well, I guess you kind of already answered a couple of my other questions, so I want to switch to India a little bit. India, you just mentioned Europe being the third power. I had always seen the statistics where China's economy grows and then India's also grows, and by 2050, India and China are these massive super economies. So, and also the prevalence, I read the prevalence of extreme poverty in India has recently dropped considerably over the past decade. So how, in your opinion, how is India's economy shaping up in this new multipolar global economy?
Yeah. It's just kind of surprising because there are like a lot of fundamental problems in India, like, the infrastructure. But overall, the country is growing rapidly at like 6-7% a year. That's the real GDP growth. So that's impressive, and a lot of that comes from services industry, which is our strength. So it's doing pretty good, and to just surpass Japan this year. Before the end of 2025, India has surpassed Japan in terms of the nominal GDP. So it's now the fourth largest economy in the world, and then it's going to surpass Germany within 2 to 3 years, unless like the Germans wake up and then they make friends with Russia and they realize that they're just being a sacrificial pawn. But looking at the German politicians, there's no hope. So it's so sad, I love Germany, but what's happening to them is just so tragic. Like they're just like stabbing themselves in the chest, Like, why, Germans? Why? Stop doing that. And so within 2 to 3 years, India will surpass Germany. So it'll be the third largest economy in the world. But it will be much smaller compared to the U.S. and China, So let's say it's like $5 trillion, and then China will still be 4 times larger than India. The U.S. will be like 6 times larger than India. So the two major poles are going to be the U.S. and China.
In your opinion, in what ways has the United States been responding to multipolarity with the rise of China, India, Brazil, even Indonesia, and lately ASEAN, ASEAN, the Southeast Asian Economic Bloc? What do you think, because it looks to me like the United States is not taking it well, that and kind of a multipolar, many nations around the world are gaining power vis-a-vis the United States. How do you think they're responding, and how do you think they should be responding?
Yeah, well, they are responding very badly, as all empires do, Nobody likes to give up the power, So that's just human nature, that's just geopolitics, there's no time in history where one empire said, okay, all right, my time has ended, and I'll just, hand over on a golden plate to my successor. No, we're going to fight back, So the U.S. is trying very hard to contain China. So all the sanctions we see, all the hybrid wars, all the propaganda wars against China are all simply based on the fact that China is succeeding and is about to take over the U.S. in terms of the economy and so many things. But it's not like China wants to be number one, China wants to be the next, the hegemon. It's just a natural process, So so if you have a neighboring kid and you used to bully him and he's only 5 years old and then he slowly grows up and then by the time he's 16, he's like much taller than you. And then you're like, oh my God, I used to beat him up a lot when he was young.
So it's an interesting metaphor.
Yeah, so like a lot of it is like, really the guilt conscience of the West, I think, because they did a lot of horrible things to China, right? Starting with the Opium Wars. And even before, subjecting millions and millions of Chinese to the addiction of opium, and that went all through the 19th century. So they did a lot of horrible things, and then the sanctions, starting with Mao, really huge sanctions, and they made Japan into a monster. So this actually started with Teddy Roosevelt, who said, okay, I want to have like an American empire, but the Americans are not going to like the U.S. becoming an empire, because the average American did not want to be the empire, and historically, starting with the founders, all the people like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, all those founders, they warned against an empire, they did not want America to become a replica of the Europeans. So Teddy Roosevelt, what he did was, he's like, okay, so let me turn Japan into like my proxy empire, right? So we control Japan, and Japan controls Asia, or East Asia, and that was the plan. So the U.S. Groomed Japan. The U.S. gave Japan the oil and the raw materials for steel, and the Wall Street. They funded the Japanese bonds. They raised money for Japan. So they groomed Japan, and they actually had Japan destroy the Russian Navy on the east side, Vladivostok. So that was in 1904, and it was like fully organized by the U.S. and maybe the U.K., So these bankers, they funded Japan to destroy Russia. And then if you see, how Japan grew, the West always supported Japan, When Japan took over Formosa or Taiwan, the West supported it. When, similarly, and then at some point, Japan became a little bit too independent, right? So, they didn't want to be a proxy anymore. They were like, hold on, we look at the world, and, so all these Westerners are doing really horrible things to people all over, and they are following their, they are creating the empire. So we want to be an empire. And then they did a lot of horrible things to China. The Chinese people, they committed a lot of crime. But the reason that the West turned against Japan is not because the Japanese did horrible things. Okay, so the Western, the bankers, the imperialists have no problem with violence and brutality. Like just look at what they did to the Africans and so on. So the violence was never a problem. The problem was that Japan became independent. Like they wanted to create their own empire. So then the U.S. very quickly switched sides. And they're, oh no, we love China. Right? And they did this huge propaganda. Like there were lots of books written about China. What's her name? Pearl somebody, she wrote, there was a woman who was a daughter of the missionaries in China, and she,
I don't know.
And she used this the pseudonym called Pearl, Pearl, and she wrote a book about China, which was turned into a movie in the 1930s, and it won the Oscars, right? So the Americans, they wanted to now switch to China. So they switched to China, not because they really loved China, because the Westerners, they colonized many parts of China and ruthlessly exploited. But just for geopolitics, they switched to China, and then they helped defeat the Japanese. And then at the end, when Mao won, they switched back. They're like, no, actually, we love Japan. We don't like China. We don't like the communists. So, but throughout the history, if you see the U.S. Geopolitics, my God, they switch sides all the time.
I was coming to that because I wanted to ask you, because, obviously the USSR was very successful, so, Kissinger went to China with Nixon and created a deal with China in 1978. And now it looks like, now that China is very powerful, it looks to me like the United States is seeking to move with India and try to get India to play pawn off against China. What is your opinion about that?
Yeah, absolutely. They just had, the Quad meeting, Japan, Australia, U.S., and India. The foreign ministers, they met in Washington, D.C. So they've been trying to draw India into the anti-China coalition, sort of like, what happened after the Boxers' Rebellion, right? So the West, they created something like the 9-country alliance. I forgot the number, but so they brought in everybody, right? Like Britain, France, U.S., Austria, Italy, and then everybody ganged up on China. So they're kind of trying to recreate that, with like Japan, Philippines, India, Australia. It's not going to work, but they'll keep trying. And, so it's kind of, sad for me as an Indian, because I want India and China to work together. We both have like history going back 2,000 plus years, So about 1,400 years ago, there was a Chinese monk, so there were like a lot of Chinese monks, but this one was very special. So he came to India, like through the mountains, like maybe through Tibet, somehow. He came to India to learn about Buddhism, because the Chinese people loved the Buddhism, but they wanted to, because there's a lot that is lost in translation, and when religion travels from India to what is now Afghanistan to what is now Xinjiang, and then by the time it reaches, Xi'an, like a lot of things they change, lost in translation and lost because of the cultural. So these monks would love to come to India, to learn from the source. And he traveled all over India. He translated so many scripts from Sanskrit to Chinese. And eventually he went to this one town in India where he stayed for the longest, And that town is the birthplace of Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. What are the chances of that? And then this monk, eventually he took the boat and stuff, and then he went back to China, like he went through Sri Lanka, and then he went back to China. And when he went back to China, he decided to spend the last of his years, the last 15, 20 years of his life in Xi'an, which is the birthplace of Xi Jinping, So we have this the amazing historical link between Modi and Xi Jinping, and between China and India. And I love China. I've been to China a couple of times now. It's a wonderful culture, and I love the economic development and how they take care of the poor people, the middle class. They're just a wonderful role model for the rest of the world. So I used to think that China is a great role model for the developing nations. But now I see that it's a good role model for the U.S., for Europe, for anybody, who wants to have a holistic, of a 360-degree development, And they're very, rational, logical, well-planned, very meritocratic. Oh, yeah!
Hey everyone, this is Jason Smith, host of The Bridge Podcast from sunny California. If you like the show, don't forget to subscribe. We love The Bridge.
The best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the art of war will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.
You're listening to The Bridge.